On a grey November afternoon in 2006, within the refined confines of London's Millennium Hotel, a seemingly unremarkable ritual unfolded. 3 men gathered for tea in the Pine Bar. The casual observer might have dismissed it as nothing more than a business meeting, or perhaps old friends catching up. But behind the clink of porcelain and polite conversation, something far more sinister was in motion. The men were indeed former colleagues, but the encounter was far from benign. Within hours, one of these men, Alexander Litvinenko, would lie dying in a London hospital bed, a deadly poison coursing through his veins. He would spend his final days unravelling the mystery of his own murder, pointing a trembling finger at the Kremlin from his deathbed. His last words, a direct accusation against the man he believed had ordered his killing. Litvinenko's journey from KGB officer to FSB dissident, from loyal servant of the Russian state to one of its most vocal critics, unfolded as if it flowed like ink through the pen of John le Carré himself. His story is a chilling tale of espionage, betrayal, and radioactive revenge. A warning that in Putin's Russia, there is no such thing as an exile too far. Alexander Sasha Litvinenko was born on the 4th of December 1962 in the Russian industrial city of Voronezh, in what was then the Soviet Union. This was a time of relative stability in the Soviet Union under Nikita Khrushchev, when the worst excesses of Stalinism had receded, albeit the rigid structures of the Soviet system remained firmly in place. Alexander's parents were Walter and Svetlana, but his family was broken up after his parents separated and were divorced when he was still an infant. The end of his parents' marriage meant that he spent his childhood between multiple Soviet cities, but when he was 12 years old, Sasha settled more permanently with his grandparents in Nalchik. This mountainous region, nestled in the shadow of the Caucasus Range, exposed the young Litvinenko to the complex ethnic tapestry of the Soviet periphery. His grandfather, a veteran of what the Soviets called the Great Patriotic War, instilled in Litvinenko early notions of patriotism and service to the state. The young Alexander's adolescence was shaped by the Soviet education system's emphasis on discipline, physical fitness, and ideological conformity. He completed his secondary education in 1980 at the age of 17, but his initial attempt to secure university placement proved unsuccessful. This academic setback redirected his path towards one of military service. Modeling himself after his grandfather, he enlisted in the Soviet Army, 1 month before his mandatory conscription date. And thus, Sasha Litvinenko was set on a path to a career in the Soviet and then Russian security services. Between 1981 and 1985, he attended a specialized military academy in North Ossetia. It was during his training in 1983 that he met and married his first wife, Natalia. Litvinenko's professional trajectory took a decisive turn in 1988 when he was transferred to a specialized division within the Ministry of Internal Affairs in Moscow. This move positioned him at the nexus of Soviet internal security at a moment of profound historical significance as the Soviet Union teetered on the edge of its existence. It was at the Ministry of Internal Affairs that Litvinenko was identified and recruited by the KGB, the formidable Committee for State Security. His initial assignment was in military counterintelligence, working in a department tasked with monitoring and enforcing loyalty within Soviet military structures. The role required a rather specific psychological profile to succeed: vigilance bordering on suspicion, attention to minute behavioral deviations, and unwavering commitment to the Soviet security paradigm. The timing of his KGB service coincided with the terminal crisis of the Soviet system. In 1991, the failed August coup against Mikhail Gorbachev accelerated the dissolution of the Soviet Union. This institutional cataclysm necessitated the reorganization of the Soviet security apparatus. The once monolithic KGB was dismantled in November of 1991, and Litvinenko's unit was incorporated into the newly established FSK, which would later be renamed the FSB in 1993 and which still exists to this day. The change from KGB to the FSB was not just a rebranding. It reflected the new Russian Federation's complicated relationship with its Soviet past, simultaneously distancing itself from certain aspects while preserving core operational methodologies and personnel networks. In 1991, Litvinenko found himself working in a department having as its mission the combating of organized crime, corruption, and terrorism. While his career was flourishing, Litvinenko's marriage to his wife Natalia was on the rocks. By 1993, the couple had become estranged, and in June of that year, Litvinenko had met his future second wife, Marina. She was a ballroom dancing teacher whom he met while working a case as a senior FSB officer. They soon moved in together, and by the summer of 1994, welcomed their first son into the world, Anatoly. Just as Sasha Litvinenko was rebuilding his personal life, fate introduced him to a man who would profoundly shape his professional one, a controversial billionaire whose name would soon become entwined with both power and peril. Born in Moscow in 1946, Boris Berezovsky was an emerging Russian oligarch whose trajectory, first from mathematician to government scientist to billionaire businessman, exemplified the chaotic economic transformation of post-Soviet Russia. Berezovsky made his first fortune after founding a car dealership named Logovaz in the late 1980s. He then diversified into TV broadcasting, airlines, and the oil industry. During the 1990s, the only thing that matched Berezovsky's wealth was his grip on political influence. Operating from his nerve center, the Logovaz Club in Moscow, he emerged as one of the foremost oligarchs of that period, finding himself firmly placed within President Boris Yeltsin's inner circle. Berezovsky's rise to power and influence made him many enemies, especially inside the former KGB, which was on the back foot after its failed coup in 1991. In an effort to cut his enemies off at the knees, Berezovsky urged Yeltsin to rein in the new FSB and to exclude former KGB operatives from high office. But, as the saying goes, it pays to keep your friends close and your enemies even closer. Berezovsky's plan was to install one of his own good friends as the head of the FSB, who was none other than a young Vladimir Putin. Berezovsky and Putin's relationship had developed in the early 1990s in St. Petersburg when Putin was working for the city's mayor, and Berezovsky was looking to expand his car dealership business. Berezovsky introduced Putin to Boris Yeltsin's team and supported his appointment as head of the FSB. There was also another potential ally within the FSB with whom Berezovsky was cultivating a relationship, Alexander Litvinenko. They first met in early 1994 when Litvinenko visited Berezovsky's offices as part of an investigation into the operations of his company. While their interactions may have been fleeting, their fates would soon become inextricably tied. Later in 1994, Boris Berezovsky left the Logovaz Club as normal in his Mercedes-Benz, accompanied by his chauffeur and a bodyguard. Suddenly, a car bomb exploded, an attempt at assassination. Although badly injured, Berezovsky survived the attack. His driver was killed instantly, while his bodyguard and 6 bystanders were severely hurt. Berezovsky spent the next 2 weeks recuperating in Switzerland, where Litvinenko was quickly dispatched. The FSB used the attack as pretext to probe further into the oligarch's business dealings and monitor his activities. Contrary to his boss's expectation, Litvinenko and Berezovsky quickly became close friends. Then, some months later in 1995, a popular Russian TV anchor and new Director General of Russia's first television station, Vladislav Letsayev, was shot dead in the stairwell of his Moscow apartment in a suspected hit. Suspicion fell on Berezovsky, who had played a fundamental role in the creation of ORT and effectively controlled it. As Moscow police arrived to arrest Berezovsky, it was Litvinenko who intervened, threatening officers with his gun and calling the head of the FSB, forcing the police to retreat. This dramatic intervention earned Berezovsky's lasting gratitude and cemented their relationship. In 1997, Litvinenko was transferred to the most secret department of the Russian FSB, the Department for the Analysis of Criminal Organizations. His boss was Major General Yevgeny Kokolkov. Litvinenko had previously investigated Kokolkov and was dismayed by the corruption he uncovered, including allegations of taking bribes and protection money from Central Asian drug lords. The evidence revealed that certain higher-ups of the URPO were involved in the heroin trade that traveled from northern Afghanistan to Europe via Russia. Litvinenko's orders from outside this department were to keep an eye on things and to report anything fishy. And fishy it was. The URPO was a covert unit within the FSB and was essentially a law unto itself. Its offices were not located at the main FSB headquarters at the Lubyanka building, but in a separate, unmarked building. It was established to combat organized crime, but in reality its primary task was to conduct special operations, often within the grey zone of legality, which inevitably meant state-sponsored and extrajudicial murder of high-ranking politicians and powerful businessmen. His initial assignments were very similar to what he had been doing previously, investigating gangs, dirty cops, and kidnappers, but things soon took a more sinister turn. He started receiving orders that crossed the line between law enforcement and criminality. These ranged from beating up former colleagues turned whistleblowers to kidnapping businessmen and shooting their guards if necessary. He refused these orders, but in 1998 he received a directive that pushed him to breaking point. He was ordered to kill his good friend Boris Berezovsky, and the order had come straight from the top. Berezovsky had evidently grown too powerful and had had a falling out with his allies. Litvinenko was told that Berezovsky was the type of criminal who was too wealthy to be brought to justice through normal means. Shocked by the orders that he had received, Litvinenko was left desperate to figure out what to do. In March of 1998, he tracked Berezovsky down to his holiday home in Switzerland, where he revealed the assassination plot to his friend. Being no stranger to death threats and attempts on his life, it took some convincing from a few other sympathetic FSB officers that the plot was genuine. Following Berezovsky's advice, Litvinenko and his colleagues raised their complaints within the power structures. He managed to secure an audience with Russia's newly appointed director of the FSB. Some said this was a man destined for even greater things. In July of 1998, Litvinenko walked into Putin's office armed with an impressive dossier and a list detailing the many drug and money-related crimes of his very own department and organization. Putin had been a former mid-level KGB operative before suddenly being thrust into a position of immense power as the director of the FSB. In him, Litvinenko thought he had an ally. He was Berezovsky's protege after all. For 40 minutes, Litvinenko laid bare the ugly truth of corruption within the FSB, including the shocking order to assassinate Boris Berezovsky. But Putin's reaction was not what Litvinenko had hoped for. The new director showed the outward signs of concern and agreement, taking the dossier of evidence and jotting down Litvinenko's number with a promise to follow up. But Litvinenko left the office that day feeling a sense of unease. And it was justified. Berezovsky and Litvinenko had made a crucial misjudgment of character. Putin was intent on restoring the FSB to the power and authority it enjoyed during the height of its KGB glory days, and he wasn't going to let oligarchs and whistleblowers stand in the way of that. After all, Putin was one of the FSB men implicated in the corruption, going back to his days in St. Petersburg working in the mayor's office. The moment he left FSB headquarters, Putin ordered his internal affairs department to turn their attention on Litvinenko himself, launching a criminal investigation and surveillance operation. His weapon was confiscated, and his salary was immediately stopped. Reeling, Litvinenko knew that the lines had been drawn, And it was only a matter of time before he was arrested, or worse. He decided that his best bet was to go public with his revelations. In November of 1998, Litvinenko orchestrated what must be understood as an extraordinary act of institutional defiance. Together with several fellow officers, Litvinenko convened a press conference in Moscow, a public forum deliberately selected to maximize visibility and preclude denial. Before assembled journalists, he systematically deconstructed the leadership failures of the FSB and disclosed a series of illicit directives he had received, most notably the order to assassinate Boris Berezovsky. The public criticism he meted out that day was viewed by the FSB and the Russian state not merely as a professional indiscretion, but an act approaching treason. The press conference strategically leveraged media visibility as a form of personal insurance, gambling that public exposure would provide some measure of protection against immediate reprisal. What followed for Sasha Litvinenko can only be described as a living hell. He was immediately dismissed from the FSB. Then, on the 25th of March 1999, he was arrested by FSB officers and was charged with abusing his position and assaulting a suspect during a previous operation. Litvinenko was confined within the FSB's specialized detention facility at Lefortovo in Moscow. This prison, with its historical legacy extending back to Stalinist purges, retained its psychological significance as a site where the state's most problematic elements were processed. And there he sat for the next 8 months, before eventually being acquitted on all charges by the Moscow Garrison Military Court. Just as Litvinenko thought the rule of law still held sway, he was promptly arrested for a second time on another manufactured charge relating to alleged mishandling of suspects and stealing goods from a Moscow market during a past operation. He was released on bail in mid-December 1999. These criminal charges were eventually dismissed in 2000. Litvinenko was released after providing written assurances that he would not leave the country. Nevertheless, a third criminal case was immediately instigated against him. This time, he was accused of planting evidence on a suspect. His passport was confiscated, and he was told that his trial would be held in camera 300 kilometers away from Moscow. Putin had become the Russian president in March of 2000. With his chief adversary's power then firmly entrenched, and believing that he was about to be put away for good far from the public eye, Sasha Litvinenko decided it was time to move. In September of 2000, he decided to leave Russia. With his FSB salary having been stopped months earlier, he relied totally on the financial support of Berezovsky, including to fund his escape. Traveling first in the direction of Nalchik, he diverted to Sochi on the Black Sea, boarding a steamboat headed for a Georgian port after bribing a border guard to ignore the no-travel list. Once in Georgia, he made his way to the capital, Tbilisi, where he contacted a waiting ally who had arranged a false Georgian passport. Georgia was still well within easy reach of the FSB, and so Litvinenko traveled to Turkey aboard Berezovsky's private plane. In the meantime, his wife Marina and son Anatoly traveled to Spain, ostensibly for a holiday, but soon joined Sasha in Turkey. Litvinenko sought political asylum at the United States Embassy in Ankara, but the Americans turned him away. Eventually, he managed to book plane tickets back to Georgia with a connecting flight in London. When, on the 1st of November 2000, the Litvinenko family arrived at the transit section of Heathrow Airport, Sasha Litvinenko strode up to the nearest police officer, stating, "I am KGB officer. I am asking for political asylum." With those words, he had made a definitive break from his home country, and one that transformed him from internal critic to external dissident. Sasha Litvinenko was interrogated by immigration officials of the UK Home Office for 8 hours. Once all was said and done, he and his family were granted temporary permission to enter the United Kingdom, pending the outcome of their formal asylum application. That process took many months, it being only in May of 2001 that the Litvinenko family was granted asylum. Back in Russia, It had soon been discovered that Sasha and his family had absconded. The criminal prosecution against him continued in his absence, the verdict, of course, being one of guilty. Attempts were made by the Russian government to extradite their dissident, but this was declined by the UK. Sasha Litvinenko wasn't the only one seeking asylum. Boris Berezovsky left Russia in October of 2000, first to France before settling in Britain, also under asylum status. Berezovsky had used his ORT TV station to criticize Putin, which saw to it that, like Litvinenko, he found himself in political exile. In London, Sasha, Marina, and Anatoly established a new domestic foundation. He would have known, however, that he was not out of harm's way. As a former FSB officer himself, he knew how far the Russian security apparatus could reach, even across international borders. Rather than cower behind a new identity in England, he went on the offensive. In 2001, he co-authored a book called Blowing Up Russia, which truly lived up to its name. The book presented evidence of FSB involvement in the 1999 apartment bombings that instigated the Second Chechen War and helped catalyze Vladimir Putin's rise to power. The tell-all book was immediately banned in Russia, with the Kremlin dismissing its contents as anti-Russian and extremist. When he wasn't writing bombshell books, he worked as a private security consultant to MI6, for which he was paid a monthly fee of £2,000. Under this arrangement, he also consulted to several other European law enforcement agencies in Estonia, Georgia, and Spain. Over time, Litvinenko's political positions hardened. His criticism of Putin and the Russian governmental system intensified, characterized by increasingly direct accusations regarding corruption and human rights abuses. He also developed a vocal advocacy for the Chechen independence movement, a position particularly provocative to Moscow. Litvinenko was not the only one with critical crosshairs aimed at Putin. He became close friends and ally of investigative journalist Anna Politkovskaya. Sasha and Anna first met during the extradition proceedings of Ahmed Zakayev in London in 2003. Anna was the daughter of a senior Russian diplomat, and, like Litvinenko, was vocal in her criticism, in particular, of Russia's involvement in Chechnya. Despite enjoying American citizenship, she continued to work primarily from Moscow. In 2004, she fell ill after drinking tea while on a flight. She made a recovery, but suspected and attempted poisoning. Then, in the spring of 2006, during a meeting in London, she told Litvinenko that she was afraid for her life. Despite his pleading, Anna returned to Moscow for the last time. On the 7th of October 2006, she was shot dead outside her Moscow apartment. Devastated by the loss and what was plainly an organized hit, at a memorial service in London on the 13th of October 2006, Litvinenko publicly attributed blame for the killing on Vladimir Putin. The Russian president, responding indirectly to the accusation, blamed the murder on unnamed opponents out to destabilize his government. Despite being acutely aware of the danger, Sasha Litvinenko continued in his relentless pursuit to bring down the Russian ruling elite. His primary target of investigation was Gazprom, the Russian gas producer, as well as other Russian state-owned giants. It was in his quest to find sources to give him an insider's look at these corporations that connected his path with a former acquaintance, Andrei Lugovoy. The two men had known each other since the mid-1990s, with Lugovoy also working for the KGB. By 2005, Lugovoy was a successful London businessman. On the 21st of October that year, Litvinenko and Lugovoy met for dinner where they discussed how the latter could facilitate access to those inside the apparatus of Russia's state-owned enterprises. Being ex-KGB and a person that Litvinenko trusted, Lugovoy seemed a valuable connection. A further meeting was arranged on the 16th of October 2006 at the offices of a UK security firm, Erensis. What Litvinenko didn't realize was that this meeting was a carefully orchestrated trap. Arriving that day at Gatwick Airport in London, along with Andrei Lugovoy, was his friend and associate Dmitry Kovtun. They passed through customs and security without incident, and checked into the Best Western Hotel on Shaftesbury Avenue. They carried with them a small vial containing a deadly poison, Polonium 210. Discovered by Marie and Pierre Curie in 1898 and named after their home country Poland, Polonium 210 is a highly radioactive isotope that primarily emits alpha particles. These cannot penetrate skin or paper, making detection of the substance only possible with highly specialized equipment. 250,000 times more toxic than hydrogen cyanide, all it takes is 1 microgram to kill an adult. When ingested, the substance delivers a focused, lethal dose of radiation to internal organs while leaving minimal external indicators. This makes it ideal for a covert operation intended to send a clear message. It was Lugovoy and Kovtun's intention that day to slip a few drops of the colorless poison into Litvinenko's drink. Their meeting lasted less than an hour. Tea was served, but either it was not drunk or the assassins were unable to execute their plan. They managed only to contaminate their hotel room and the table at which they were seated with Litvinenko and another man from Irensis. The assassins dined later that night at the Itsu sushi restaurant in Piccadilly, leaving behind a radioactive trail when they returned to Moscow. On the 25th of October, Lugovoy returned to London alone, staying at the Sheraton Hotel on Park Lane. He met again with Litvinenko at the hotel's Palm Court bar, but again failed to administer the poison. A hand towel later found stuck in a basement chute at the hotel showed an alarming 10,000 counts per second of polonium radiation. The assassins were remarkably careless with what was probably the world's most expensive poison, and no doubt those that put them up to the job were not impressed. They would soon, however, return for a final, fateful attempt. On the morning of the 31st of October 2006, Lugovoy started his day by visiting the office of Boris Berezovsky, a man who trusted Lugovoy implicitly. When Lugovoy departed, he left behind traces of Polonium 210 on the leather couch on which he had sat. Next, he and Kovtun reconvened with Litvinenko later that day at the office of Irensis in Mayfair. They had again come armed with the poison, but luck, or perhaps Litvinenko's instincts, intervened. A clumsy hand, a jostled glass, and the polonium missed its target once more, splashing instead onto a green baize tabletop. Thereafter, and back in his hotel room, a frustrated Lugovoy spilled more of the precious poison across the drawer in his bathroom. And then came the 1st of November 2006, the day that would forever sear Litvinenko's name into the annals of modern espionage and geopolitics. That morning, he left his home in Muswell Hill around 11:30 a.m., boarding a London bus to the city centre. Around lunchtime, he met Mario Scaramella, an Italian security consultant, at the Itsu sushi restaurant in Piccadilly. Scaramella claimed that he had come into possession of a list of assassination targets, which included both of their names. The men's hushed conversation came to an end around 3 p.m. At approximately 5 p.m., Litvinenko entered the Pine Bar at the Millennium Hotel in Mayfair. Lugovoy and Kovtun were already waiting. They sat at a quiet table, tucked discreetly in the back. Drinks were ordered. Litvinenko, always a creature of habit, chose green tea. It was at that moment, the clink of porcelain, the swirl of tea in a pot, that the plan succeeded. As Litvinenko sipped, he commented that the tea tasted a bit funny. It was a fleeting remark. What he couldn't know was that the teapot held a dose of polonium 210 large enough to kill 100 men. Later that night, oblivious to the poison then coursing through his system, Litvinenko returned home to celebrate with his wife, Marina. It had been 6 years since their dramatic escape from Russia, and just hours earlier, they had become British citizens. Marina cooked his favorite meal. They toasted to a new chapter. But the celebration was short-lived. Within hours, Litvinenko began to vomit violently. The symptoms came fast and hard: nausea, pain, profuse sweating. He immediately suspected poisoning. Not food poisoning, not a stomach virus, but something darker, and something deliberate. Litvinenko's medical ordeal would span the next 3 weeks. Initially admitted to Barnet Hospital on the 3rd of November, his condition deteriorated despite intensive medical intervention. On the 17th of November, he was transferred to University College Hospital as his symptoms intensified. Medical specialists struggled to identify the specific toxin responsible for his condition. Only in the final hours of his life did specialized testing by the Atomic Weapons Establishment reveal the presence of polonium-210 in his system, by which point the radiation had inflicted irreversible damage to his vital organs. Even if it had been detected earlier, there was likely not much that could have been done to save him. Between the 18th and the 20th of November, and as he fought for his life, Litvinenko gave interviews to Scotland Yard. He named Scaramella, Lugovoy and Kovtun as his potential poisoners. Scaramella was quickly ruled out. It became clear that the Russian FSB, and possibly even Putin himself, were behind the poisoning. On the 21st of November, as he lay on his deathbed in the intensive care unit, he dictated a statement with the help of his lawyer, George Menzies. In it, he expressly accused Russian President Vladimir Putin of ordering his assassination, a final act of defiance that ensured his death would carry political significance beyond the personal tragedy. His statement read, in part, "You may succeed in silencing one man, but the howl of protest from around the world will reverberate, Mr. Putin, in your ears for the rest of your life." Alexander Sasha Litvinenko then died at 8:51 p.m. on the 23rd of November 2006, his third cardiac arrest being the final culmination of acute radiation syndrome. His funeral took place on the 8th of December 2006 at Highgate Cemetery in London. His body had to be placed in a special sealed casket provided by the Health Protection Agency due to the radioactivity. The family home was sealed off due to radioactive contamination, and Scotland Yard assigned 2 officers to Marina and Anatoly for their protection. The radiation trail left by the killers Lugovoy and Kovtun would eventually lead investigators back to Moscow, but justice would remain elusive. This wasn't just an assassination, it was a message in radiation sprawled across the streets of London. Being an exceptionally rare radioactive isotope, polonium-210 is a near-perfect assassination tool. But, once detected, it points clearly to a state-sponsored operation. The field of potential perpetrators of the crime was immediately narrowed to state actors with advanced nuclear capabilities. The investigation that followed transformed portions of London into a nuclear crime scene. British authorities soon tracked microscopic traces of the radioactive substance, reconstructing not just the assassination, but the perpetrator's entire movements. From the offices of Irensis to the Itsu sushi bar, various hotel rooms, and beyond, everywhere Lugovoy and Kovtun went, alpha radiation was left in their wake. When British prosecutors charged Lugovoy and Kovtun with murder in 2007, the Russian government's response was telling. They refused extradition on constitutional grounds. Lugovoy was elevated to the Russian State Duma as a member of the Liberal Democratic Party, granting him parliamentary immunity and signaling institutional protection at the highest levels. In 2023, Lugovoy was diagnosed with prostate cancer, perhaps his clumsy handling of the radioactive substance during his murderous mission finally catching up with him. Kovtun claimed also to have been poisoned during his trip to London, but somehow made a remarkable recovery. He too never faced his accusers and fell largely into obscurity after the events in 2006. He was reported to have died of COVID-related complications in Moscow in 2022. The public inquiry, campaigned for by Sasha's widow Marina, but long delayed until 2015 due to many political and judicial obstacles, was chaired by Sir Robert Owen. He delivered remarkably specific conclusions. Beyond reasonable doubt, the investigation determined that Litvinenko was poisoned with the explicit approval of the Russian state, with evidence suggesting direct involvement from FSB Director Nikolai Patrushev and probably President Vladimir Putin himself. Litvinenko's elimination was motivated by far more than silencing a single critic. His public accusations about FSB involvement in apartment bombings, allegations of security service collusion with organized crime, and advocacy for Chechen independence had positioned him as a significant threat to the Russian state's carefully constructed narrative. Russia's response to the killing and the accusations of its involvement was largely one of denial, counter-accusation, and obstruction. They said that Polonium 210 was far too conspicuous a poison to use, arguing that the killing was a plot orchestrated by British intelligence. Still living in London, Marina Litvinenko remains an active voice against Vladimir Putin's regime, advocating for justice and political accountability. Sasha's longtime confidant and benefactor, Boris Berezovsky, died at his London home in 2013. A post-mortem confirmed his cause of death as hanging. Whether he took his own life or it was foul play remains a mystery. Alexander Litvinenko's story is simultaneously deeply personal and profoundly geopolitical, a life that began in the dying years of the Soviet Empire and ended in an act that would strain international relations for years. To understand Litvinenko is to understand the Russia that both created and destroyed him.